It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Meng-Tat Chia. I don't know whether that pronunciation works. I'm sorry. On behalf of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies and also on behalf of the Center of Buddhist Studies, which has the privilege of hosting Jack as a postdoctoral fellow. That's wonderful that you're here. And it's wonderful that you've agreed to give a talk and talk about your research. I should say that the principal sponsor and collaborator of Jack is Penny, Dr. Penny Edwards, who for family reason has to be in the UK. So I have the pleasure to, in a sense, stand in for her. One of the areas in which Jack works is Indonesia. And before introducing Jack in a little bit more detail, allow me to reference our late colleague, Dr. Jeff Hadler, who is an Indonesianist in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies. With the generous support of his parents and other donors, we are establishing, the library is establishing an endowment in his name for a collection of Indonesian books and artifacts that the nucleus of that collection is actually Jeff's own collection. And we will celebrate this tomorrow at 4:30 in the reading room of the South and Southeast Asia section of the library here in Do. And if you've responded positively, please come. If you did not respond positively, please come anyway. It's a great privilege to have you stay with us because what you do is in many ways a great complement to what the group in Buddhist studies normally does. We principally work on pre-modern Buddhist traditions, and regrettably we don't cover Southeast Asia to the degree that it warrants to be covered, even though we have some coverage, and Trent Walker is completing his dissertation on Cambodian Buddhism, but that is mainland Southeast Asia. So that what we're really missing is the coverage of what you could call the maritime component of that, in particular Indonesia and the Malay world, Malaysia and Singapore. And Jack's work is focused on that area and the relationship of that area to China, which is of course principal. And he's going to talk today about the complex networks and the flow in multiple directions between China proper and these Southeast Asian maritime areas and nations. It's of course a relationship that goes way beyond the 19th and 20th century, but the focus of your work is on the modern period. And that is, again, not just a geographical, but also time-wise, a great complement to what we do with our own focus on the pre-modern period. It raises the specter of Buddhist modernism, which in a sense connects the Buddhist nations across Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, and also Central Asia, and ties in the West too in important ways, and I think continues to be really critical for the way the future of Buddhism will shape. We have a student in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies, Padma Maitland, who does some work related to this, but that's strictly in India proper. As I said, Jack is a postdoctoral fellow in the Center of Buddhist Studies. He's also senior lecturer in the Department of History at the National University of Singapore, where his academic career started. He earned his BA and his MA at that institution. And then he moved for his training to the United States. He earned his second MA at Harvard University in regional studies with a focus on East Asia, and then did his PhD at Cornell University. before returning to Singapore, where, as I said, he's appointed as senior lecturer. He's also held visiting appointments in Indonesia and in particularly in Taiwan, where he's been teaching. He has a book out that came out last year and a number of really important articles. The book Living with Myths in Singapore was published by Ethos Books in Singapore last year. He has a number of actually important peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He's been very prolific and productive. And I'm grateful for you to speak, for you giving us the benefit of, for you to be our guest and visitor, for being part of our community, coming to our events, to the Pro Seminar. It's wonderful to have you here, and thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Alex, for the kind and generous introduction. I want to start by thanking Alex, Bob, Penny, and Sanjay for hosting me at Berkeley, and to Frank for organizing my talk, giving me many helpful tips on publishing, and most importantly, for letting me use his espresso machine. I will begin my talk by considering the category Southeast Asian Buddhism. The term Southeast Asian Buddhism brings to mind Theravada Buddhism, the dominant religion in the mainland Southeast Asian states of Burma, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. Needless to say, Southeast Asianists have long been interested in studying how Buddhism played a role in shaping the history, culture, and politics of mainland Southeast Asia. While Vietnam is considered a part of mainland Southeast Asia, Vietnamese Buddhism, which is mainly of the Mahayana tradition, is often regarded as part of the East Asian Buddhism that follows the Chinese language canon and widely practiced in China, Japan, and Korea. In contrast, maritime Southeast Asia conjures the image of the Malay archipelago, consisting of the Malay majority Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, as well as the Catholic Philippines. Singapore, on the other hand, where I came from, is deemed as an anomaly because of the predominant Chinese population. Scholars of Southeast Asia tend to highlight the cultural and historical differences between mainland and Southeast Asia by emphasizing the religious contrast between mainland Theravada Buddhism and maritime Islam and Catholicism to conceptualize the religious diversity of Southeast Asia as a region. In doing so, these studies fail to recognize the presence of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia and its significance among Chinese communities in the predominant Islamic and Catholic region. On the other hand, scholars of Buddhism have often limited the study of Southeast Asian Buddhism to the Theravada Buddhist majority of mainland Southeast Asia. For instance, Donna Scherer's seminal work, The Buddhist World of Southeast Asia, focuses only on Theravada Buddhism in Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Patana Kitiasa's State of the Field article also limits the study of Southeast Asian Buddhism to Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia and suggests that, quote, Theravada Buddhism is one of the most important fields of inquiry within the larger context of Southeast Asian studies, unquote. While Anne Hansen's article on modern Buddhism in Southeast Asia discusses Buddhist reform movements in Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, she does recognize the presence of a vibrant Chinese Buddhist minority community in Malaysia at the end of her essay. In other words, previous scholarship has considered the category Southeast Asian Buddhism to be almost synonymous with Theravada Buddhism. There are three possible reasons to explain the dichotomy between mainland Theravada Buddhism and maritime Islam and Catholicism in the study of Southeast Asia. First, this could be attributed to the historiography of writing nation-state history of Southeast Asia. Scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism and historians of Southeast Asia generally tend to write the narrative of Southeast Asian countries in a linear fashion from early modern Buddhist kingdoms to modern Buddhist majority nation states. This linear narrative neglects the Chinese presence and the connectivity of Chinese Buddhist monks across the South China Sea. A second reason could be the form of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia. The majority of the Buddhists in Indonesia Malaysia, and Singapore are ethnic Chinese adhering to Mahayana Buddhism. Therefore, scholars of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asian states tend to come from a background of Sinology and East Asian Buddhist studies, and to consider Chinese Buddhism in Southeast Asia as an extension of Chinese Buddhism rather than as Southeast Asian Buddhism. Additionally, many of them publish their works in Chinese, which are inaccessible to scholars of Southeast Asia who do not read the language. Consequently, there is a lack of conversation and engagement between scholars working on Chinese Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia and scholars of Theravada Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia. Thirdly, and closely related to the second reason, academic boundaries and institutional limitations create a gap between scholars trained in Southeast Asian Buddhism and in East Asian Buddhism. While scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism are linguistically trained in Pali and mainland Southeast Asian languages, scholars of East Asian Buddhism usually study Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and the modern European research language. For this reason, scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism are equipped with country-specific linguistic and cultural knowledge under the assumption that they will be studying Theravada Buddhism on the mainland. In his article, Buddhism in Modern Southeast Asia, Justin McDaniel cautions that Theravadins are not the only Buddhists in Southeast Asia, but there are also Mahayana Buddhists in the region, especially in Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia. Furthermore, he writes that Theravadins are not limited to mainland Southeast Asia and highlights that many Thai monks are now serving as Buddhist missionaries in Indonesia. So far, there has been little research on both Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia. The paucity of literature contrasts with the extensive study of Theravada Buddhism in mainland Southeast Asia. My talk today aims to address the dichotomous framing of mainland Theravada, maritime Islamic Catholicism in the study of modern Southeast Asia, and attempts to shed some light on the much neglected Buddhist community in mainland Southeast Asia. I am attempting, in other words, to bridge the study of Southeast Asian Buddhism and the study of Chinese Buddhism. My current book manuscript uses a career of three Chinese monks, Zhu Mo, Yen Pei, and Asin Jarakita as case studies to explore the intellectual and institutional history of Buddhism in the southern part of the Malay archipelago that consists of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. I argue for the need to broaden the category of Southeast Asian Buddhism beyond Theravada Buddhism on mainland Southeast Asia to include South China Sea Buddhism in the maritime region of Southeast Asia. By South China Sea Buddhism, I refer to the varied forms of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia that use Mandarin Chinese, Southern Chinese dialects, and Southeast Asian languages in their liturgy and scriptures. I owe the term South China Sea Buddhism to M. Blackburn's work on Indian Ocean Buddhism. In sketching out an intellectual case for Indian Ocean Buddhism, M. Blackburn emphasizes the connected history of Buddhist communities in South and Southeast Asia. I find the idea of Indian Ocean Buddhism, a term that M. Blackburn used to analyze Buddhist mobility and networks across regions, helpful to my discussion of Buddhist connections between China and Southeast Asia. My talk will explore the transregional Buddhist networks connecting Southeast China and the Chinese diaspora from the 19th century to 1949. I will discuss how new patterns of Buddhist mobility contributed to the circulation of people, ideas, and resources across the South China Sea. I show that, on the one hand, Buddhist monks and religious knowledge move along these networks from China to Southeast Asia, while money from wealthy overseas Chinese were channeled along the networks for temple building in China. On the other hand, Buddhist monks rely on the networks to support China's war effort and facilitate relocation to Southeast Asia during the Sino-Japanese War. My talk is divided into three parts. First, I will speak about Chinese migration and spread of Buddhism to maritime Southeast Asia. Next, I will discuss monastery construction and the rise of institutional Buddhism in the Chinese diaspora. And third, and most importantly, I will present the Buddhist circulation in the South China Sea region during the first half of the 20th century. The Chinese were trading in the region that we now know as Southeast Asia as early as the Han Dynasty. The Nanhai trade, as Wang Gongwu writes, was the ancient maritime trade between China and Southeast Asia across the vast body of water that we now call the South China Sea. The Fujian and Guangdong provinces situated along the South China coast were important ports for South China Sea trade. These coastal provinces were also the epicenter for migration to Southeast Asia. The epicenter consisted of two physiographical macro-regions, which according to William Skinner were the Lingnan and Southeast macro-regions. You can see on the map, these are the two macro-regions, the Lingnan and the Southeast coast, right here. The economics of macro-regions were determined by transport of goods from the periphery, usually via water through the river basins, and centering in the commercialized core, surrounded by plains and river deltas. Beginning in the 16th century, the attraction of commercial and trading opportunities motivated Europeans to establish colonies in Southeast Asia. In 1511, the Portuguese captured the Islamic kingdom of Malacca in order to gain control of the Southeast Asian spice trade, as well as the trade with China. Several decades later, in the 1550s, the Portuguese gained a foothold in China's southern coastal port of Macau. Following the establishment of Portuguese Malacca, Portuguese collaborated with Chinese traders and engaged them as middlemen in the colonial trading port. As the Chinese population grew larger by the 16th century, the Portuguese worked with them through a local Chinese capitan system, a wealthy and influential merchant in the immigrant community. A century later, after the capture of Malacca, the Dutch East Indian Company founded Batavia, which is present-day Jakarta, in 1619. The British East Indian Company began to acquire territories in the Indian subcontinent during the mid-18th century and emerged as a major player in Southeast Asian colonialism later than the Portuguese and the Dutch. In 1789, Francis Light established Penang to serve as an English trading emporium in the Straits of Malacca, an area strategically located in the trade route between India and China. The early British settler attempt to attract Chinese traders in the region to the newly established colony. After 3 decades of competition and rivalry with the Dutch for control over the Straits of Malacca, Britain colonized the island of Singapore in 1819 and later acquired Malacca in exchange for Bencoolen from Dutch in 1824. Besides attracting long-established Chinese merchants from Malacca, the economic potential of Penang and Singapore attracted an increasing flow of Chinese immigrants from Fujian and Guangdong provinces of South China. This created an international nexus centered on Singapore with branches in Malacca and Penang, which historian Philip Kuhn calls a trading network based on Sino-British economic energies. Large-scale Chinese immigration began in the mid-19th century and lasted through the 1930s. Mass Chinese migration to Malaya and Singapore began in the mid-19th century and especially following the British forward movement policy from the 1870s. The British colonial authorities recruited a large number of Chinese from the coastal provinces to work in the tin mine and rubber plantations on the Malay Peninsula. In Penang, Chinese immigrants found employment opportunity in the sugar plantation as well as in shops and craft in the main settlement of Georgetown on the island. Chinese immigrants also migrated to Dutch East Indies and engaged in occupations such as traders and artisans since the first half of the 19th century. The arrival and settlement of Chinese immigrants contributed to the spread of Chinese Buddhism into Malay archipelago as early as the 17th century. In 1673, the Hokkien merchants in Malacca established the Cheng Hong Ting, or Qingyun Ting, also known as the Blue Clouds Pavilion, to worship the Avalokitesvara or Guanyin. The temple was originally named the Guanyin Pavilion after Guanyin and was renamed Blue Clouds or Qingyun as a metaphor for high officials, suggesting that the Chinese capitan who held office within the temple was similar to scholar officials in the homeland. The temple served many social needs of the Chinese immigrant community. It was a place of worship, a richer center of the Chinese community, and a shared space for ancestor sacrifice, preserving the ancestor tablets of the deceased migrants. Later, the temple offered charitable assistance and education to the overseas Chinese community in Malacca. And inscriptions erected in 1801 to commemorate the reconstruction of the Blue Clouds Pavilion tells us the motivations behind the construction of the temple, as well as the form of Buddhism adhered by the Chinese migrants. And this was the inscription. Why was this Blue Clouds Pavilion built? We merchants carry goods around for sale, not afraid to ford the streams and cross the oceans to travel to this land, striving to emulate Tao and Yi. This indeed shows our lofty ambition. The reason why divination showed that it would further one's fortune to cross the great water, which is the South China Sea, was because gods and Buddhas, or Senfo, have blessed us. This is why this temple was built. Its construction is to manifest the Buddha's efficacy. Its name to arouse people's ambition. To amass a fortune through trade has been a long-standing practice since ancient time. Those who acquire wealth should have lofty ambitions. Their high aspirations are like the blue clouds finding their way to the skies. Making profit should not be insufficient for making an honorable name. Therefore, we place a plaque on the temple inscribed with Blue Clouds Pavilion. This inscription reveals several interesting insights about the form of Chinese Buddhism that early Chinese immigrants brought to the Malay archipelago. First, Chinese merchants, not Buddhist monks, were responsible for bringing Buddhism to Malacca and running the temple in the host country prior to the last decade of the 19th century. In fact, the leadership committee of the Blue Clouds Pavilion served the colonial government as port custom collectors, one of whom was the Capitan leading the Chinese community. Leadership of the Chinese community was closely identified with the temple's leadership committee, such that the title head of the pavilion, or Tingzu, was used to designate the leader of the Chinese community even after the British authorities abolished the Capitan system in 1826. Furthermore, the mention of gods and Buddha, or Senfo, in the inscription suggests that Chinese immigrants worship the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas along with various Chinese gods. Many Chinese immigrants venerated the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas along with Taoist deities and practiced the Confucian rite of ancestor worship. This form of pre-institutional Chinese Buddhism, as some scholars call a unity of the three teachings, or Sanjiao Heyi, of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, was common among the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia. The Chinese who migrated to Java founded 7 temples between the 17th and the early 19th century. Kim Tek-in, the oldest Buddhist temple in Indonesia, was founded in 1650 in Gudok, a Chinese district in the southwest of Batavia. Although there is no inscription commemorating its establishment, it is known to be the oldest Buddhist temple still in existence in Indonesia, although it was burned down 2 years ago, but it has since been rebuilt. The temple was established under the initiative of Lieutenant Lei Zhenlan, Guo Xunguan, and was completed in 1669 during the tenure of Capitan Guo Junguo. From temple inscriptions, it appears that the Capitan and his Chinese community leaders were behind the management and funding of the temple, while the monks were hired as ritual specialists for the local community. Jonas Daniel Van, a British colonial official and lawyer in Singapore, makes several interesting observations on Buddhism in his 1879 book, The Manners and Customs of the Chinese of the Straits Settlements. During his visits to Tien Hock Gang in Singapore, Van noticed that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas were worshipped along Chinese deities Mazhu, Guangdi, and Baoshen Dadi. He observed that Chinese devotees would light candles and incense sticks to pay homage to all deities in the temples. Van pointed out that the Sakyamuni statue was dressed in a blue robe and a Chinese skull cap. He also noticed that there were 6 monks residing in the temple. More interestingly, one recorded his observation of the morning and evening rituals and his conversation with the resident monks. At 4 o'clock in the morning and again at 4 in the afternoon, the service is conducted in the Buddhist temple. The priests are closely shaved, with one or two exceptions are intelligent-looking men. They have enough to live on and are allowed a cook to provide their daily meals. As the bell strikes 4, one of the priests dresses himself first in a white surplice, and over that he wears a long gray coat. He then lights 2 lamps before Buddha and takes a short rowing cane in each hand, opens a book written in Chinese characters, and commences to chant in Gregorian tones very slowly, rising and lowering his voice from time to time, melodiously enough and striking at certain pauses. First, with the stick in his right hand on a hollow tortoise-shaped piece of wood, and then with his left hand on a clear-sounding metal bell. And this is the more interesting part. Occasionally, striking with both hands at the same time. The performance on the bell and tortoise is probably to keep the god wide awake. The chanting gets faster and faster as the priest goes on. The Chinese who had assembled in curiosity and those who accompanied the writer were certainly unimpressed by the ceremony. One man learned in Chinese classics who spoke Malay fluently told the writer that he did not understand the word that the priest was saying, and he was sure that the priests were as ignorant themselves. We asked a priest if he understood the books. He said no, it was a sacred and mysterious language understood only by the gods. The Baba read a page of the book aloud. The words were in Chinese, it is true, but convey no meaning to the reader's mind, nor to the minds of those who were listening. The priest said the book had been brought from China. Several conclusions can be made about Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia during the 19th century in the light of Joanna's advanced candid observation. First, Buddhist deities were worshipped in Chinese temple and vice versa. The overseas Chinese did not differentiate Buddhist deities from Chinese local gods and worship these sacred images by lighting candles and incense sticks. Second, Chinese Buddhist monks resided and performed religious ceremonies in Chinese temples. They brought their richer knowledge, liturgical musical instruments, and Chinese scriptures across the South China Sea. In fact, Buddhist ceremonies that Van described were similar to the rituals that scholars observed in the Fujian province during the 19th century. Third, Chinese migrant monks did not understand the meaning and significance of the Buddhist scriptures. Most of them were hired as ritual specialists to perform rites in temples and at funerals. The institutional form of Chinese Buddhism only appeared in maritime Southeast Asia during the last decade of the 19th century. By institutional Buddhism, I refer to Buddhism as an organized religion with a system of teaching, rituals, clerics, and organizations. The arrival of educated Chinese monks in the Malay archipelago contributed to the institutionalization of Buddhism and the subsequent monastery building efforts among the overseas Chinese communities. The first Buddhist monastery to be constructed was the Keong or Jilesi in Penang. The founding of the Keong was a result of the combination of colonial interference in Chinese temple affairs and the arrival of a migrant monk. The founding of Keong can be traced to Gong Hock, as we see here, also known as Guangfu Gong in Penang. In 1800, the Cantonese and Hokkien migrants in Penang collaborated to establish the Gong Hock Keong Temple. Just like the Blue Clouds Pavilion in Malacca and the Kim Tek Inn in Batavia discussed earlier, Gong Hock Keong was also known as the Guan Yin Pavilion and was established to venerate Guan Yin and was home to several migrant monks. In 1887, the British colonial government responded to complaints that the monks at Gong Hock Keong Temple were engaging in unmonastic behavior. Consequently, the colonial authorities appointed new directors and gave them the power to appoint and fire monks. The new board of trustees, which consisted of a justice of priests, a state councillor, the head of the Ku Gong Si, and a wealthy merchant, fired the unruly monks and searched for a senior monk to assume the abbacy of the temple. So they had a job search. They invited Biao-in or Miao-Lian from Fuzhou, who happened to be in Penang raising funds to renovate his monastery in China, to become the abbot of Keong. And this is Biao-Lian or Miao-Lian. Biao-Lian was ordained and received his monastic training at Yongchen Monastery in Fuzhou. He later became a well-known Dharma teacher and abbot of the monastery. In 1875, Biao-Lian traveled to Taiwan and South Asia to raise funds for the renovation of Yongchen Monastery. In 1888, when Biao-Lian again returned to Penang to fundraise for Yongchen Monastery, Keong's trustee board requested him to become the abbot, which he agreed. However, Biao-Lian's tenure at Keong did not last long. After becoming the abbot of the temple located in Georgetown, the busy capital city of Penang, he found the place too noisy and inconducive for spiritual cultivation. Moreover, he was concerned with the quality or the lack of the monastic in Malaya. For these reasons, Biao-Lian decided to establish a Buddhist monastery in Penang to teach the Dharma to the overseas Chinese community and as a place of cultivation for migrant monks. Upon its completion in 1891, Kek Lok Si, which became a branch temple of the Yongchen Monastery in Fuzhou, was at that time the largest Chinese Buddhist monastery in Southeast Asia. So this is the Kek Lok Si. In 1904, Biao-Lian wrote to the Qing court in China to request for a set of Tripitaka for his monastery. According to an inscription of a telegraph message from the Office of Supervision of Sangha Affairs, his request was approved by the Imperial Household Department. The Qing court bestowed the Kek Lok Si with a set of Qing edition of the Tripitaka. They also awarded Biao-Lian with imperial purple robes, an alms bowl, and a monastic staff for his effort in spreading Buddhism to the overseas Chinese. Similar trends were taking place in British Singapore and in the Dutch East Indies. In 1898 in Singapore, Xian Hui, with the invitation and support of wealthy businessman Law Kim Bong or Liu Jingbang, established the Xionglim Monastery or Shuangling Si, the first Chinese Buddhist monastery in Singapore. Law Kim Bong, a Chinese immigrant from Fujian who came to Singapore in 1858, went from rags to riches and became a wealthy businessman and influential leader in the Chinese community. He was a founding director of the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry and a board member of the Singapore Hokkien Association. A popular legend has it that Lo and his son both dreamed of a holy monk radiating gold light and arriving in Singapore from the west. Soon after receiving this omen, the father and son met an entourage of 12 Buddhist monastics led by Xian Hui that stopped in Singapore and rode to China after a 6-year pilgrimage to Burma, Ceylon, and India. Lo Kim Bong invited the monastics to stay in Singapore and asked Xian Hui to serve as the abbot of the monastery that he planned to build. Xian Hui, with the help of Lo, obtained a plot of land at Kim Kiat Road and raised funds to construct the Xiongling Monastery as a branch monastery of the Xitan Monastery in Fuzhou. Xian Hui's travels in Burma, Ceylon, and India, as M. Blackburn writes, can be understood in the context of transregional religious journeys to seek access to the Indic Buddhist world during the 19th century. Xian Hui, like several Chinese and Japanese monks of his time, made pilgrimages to the sacred sites associated with the historical Sakyamuni Buddha. For this reason, Xiongling Monastery, established under Xian Hui's abbacy, promoted Buddhism that was devotionally and ritually accepted by both the Chinese and Pali-using Southern Asian Buddhist diaspora in Singapore. By 1904, Xiongling Monastery was not only the center for Chinese Buddhism, but also a religious space involving Chinese and Sinhalese Buddhists in Singapore. In the Dutch East Indies, Indonesian monks considered Ben Qing as the first Chinese monk to spread the Dharma in colonial Java. Qing was born in 1878 in the Fujian province of China. At the age of 19, he became a novice at the Putian Guangfu Monastery. In 1901, Qing traveled south to Dutch East Indies for the first time to propagate the Dharma. Unlike his counterparts in Penang and Singapore, he did not have the intention to establish a monastery in the Indies. Rather, he resided at the Dekatsi, an 18th century Chinese temple located in Semarang, Central Java, to teach the Dharma to the overseas Chinese community for 3 years before returning to China. In 1926, he went back to the East Indies and resided in the Jade Lotus Hall, a small Buddhist shrine in West Java. In 1949, when the shrine was relocated, the ownership of the land was transferred to Qing. At that time, the Chinese Civil War with the impending communist victory meant that Qing could not return to China. Therefore, he decided to settle in Jakarta and build a monastery. Qing, with the assistance of disciples, expanded the shrine into a monastery. In 1951, the Gong Si, or Guanghua Si, was opened and named after the Guanghua Monastery in Putian, China. It was to become an important site for the development of Chinese Buddhism in post-colonial Indonesia. The arrival and settlement of Chinese monks and the subsequent construction of monasteries in the East Indies, Malaya, and Singapore paved the way to the emergence of institutional Buddhism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Unlike their predecessors who were primarily ritual specialists, this new breed of migrant monks received the monastic training in China and were concerned with the dissemination of Buddhist doctrines to the Chinese community. Within the second half of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, social political changes in China gave rise to a Buddhist reform movement, which in turn contributed to the making of a vibrant South China Sea Buddhist networks. During the late Qing period, the last of the imperial dynasty of China under the Manchu leaders, many political reformers saw Buddhist monks as ritual specialists and concluded that the average monks had little education and ability to contribute towards national revival. Some even proposed that the Qing government should confiscate the assets of Buddhist monasteries to fund the state's modernization projects. The 1911 revolution ended the Qing dynasty and gave birth to the Republic of China. The early years of the Republic were a time of intellectual and cultural creativity. The emergence of the new cultural movement, beginning in the mid-1910s, which culminated in the May 4th movement in 1919 and continued into the 1920s, was a time when intellectuals attacked Confucian values, patriarchal traditions, and popular religious practices, while promoted science, democracy, and the use of the vernacular. Buddhist clerics at that time perceived the proposed confiscation of Buddhist properties during the late Qing period and the Republican government's religious policy as an attack on Buddhist institutions. This gave rise to a number of prominent monks and lay teachers who attempt to inspire and lead the Buddhist reform movement to reform and modernize the religion. Following the founding of the Republic, Buddhist reformers established national-level Buddhist associations to protect their interests, furthered lay Buddhist associations, set up printing presses, and engaged in philanthropic activities. Some Buddhist intellectuals embraced scientific language and ideas. Nanputuo Monastery, a well-known Buddhist monastery located in Xiamen, a major port city in Fujian province on China's southeastern coast, became an important headquarters for these modernist monks. And this is the Xiamen, which is right here. Many historians have noticed the strategic coastal location of Xiamen since the early modern period, which contributed to its importance both as a major port for maritime trade as well as an ancestor hometown or Qiaoxiang for the Chinese who migrated to various parts of Southeast Asia. The rise of Xiamen as development into a maritime center for the South China Sea trade, as Keong suggests, began around the first half of the 17th century. The vibrant maritime trade in Xiamen, which allowed frequent contact with the outside world, as well as remittances from the overseas Chinese, had led to the rapid urbanization of the coastal city at the turn of the 20th century. Given the strategic location of the Nanputuo Monastery in the port city of Xiamen, which was a nodal point of the maritime trading networks and epicenter of Chinese migration, it became a major base for Buddhist modernist movement and monastic education during the first half of the 20th century. In 1920, Venerable Guangfu became the abbot of Nanputuo Monastery. He revamped the abbacy system of the monastery and converted it from a Tangxi kingship temple, also known as Zisun Miao, to a monastery of the 10 directions, Sifang Chongling. In doing so, Guangfu hoped to eradicate nepotism in the selection of future abbots and create a more democratic means of electing leaders. In 1924, Hui Quan was elected to succeed Guangfu as the abbot of the Nanputuo Monastery. And this is the Nanputuo Monastery. And this is Hui Quan. Born in Tong'an district of Xiamen, Hui Quan was ordained at Huxiyan Monastery in Xiamen, and later received his monastic training at various monasteries in Ningbo, Jiangsu, and Zhejiang provinces. His classmates at the Ningbo Tiantong Monastery included Taixu and Yuan Ying, whom I will discuss later. Following the founding of the Republic of China, Hui Quan became the abbot of Chentian Monastery and established the Yutan Xueling to teach elementary Buddhist teachings to monastic and laity. His efforts to promote Buddhist education earned him the reputation of the foremost monk of southern Fujian, or Mingnan Shenzhong Jubo. After being elected as the abbot of the Nanputuo Monastery in 1924, Hui Quan became an advocate for monastic education in southern China. A year later, he founded the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, as we see over here, Mingnan Fo Xueyuan, which became an influential seminary and intellectual center for Buddhist education in Republican China. Upon completing his 3-year term as the abbot and founding rector of the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, Hui Quan stepped down and was succeeded by Buddhist reformer and thinker Taixu. Taixu was one of the most prominent figures among the Buddhist reformers during the Republican period. Born in 1819 in Chongde County of Zhejiang Province, he became a novice in Jiangsu and received his higher ordination at the Tiantong Monastery in Ningbo. After his higher ordination, Taixu received his monastic training at the Tiantong Monastery. Later, he studied with lay Buddhist scholar Yang Wenhui at the Jitavana Hermitage. After the founding of the Republic, Taixu spearheaded the Buddhist revival movement of Fojiao Fuxing Yundong and advocated for the need to reform the Buddhist monastic system and promote education. In 1922, Taixu founded the Wuchang Buddhist Institute, where he aimed to educate a new generation of young monks in China. A year later, he became the inaugural president of the World Buddhist Fellowship. With a growing reputation among like-minded Buddhist reformers, Taixu was elected to succeed Hui Quan as the abbot of Nanputuo Monastery and rector of the Mingnan Buddhist Institute. Under the abbacy of Taixu, Nanputuo Monastery became a headquarters for the Buddhist modernist movement in South China and served as a key nodal point in the networks connecting monks in China and the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia. The South China Sea networks brought Taixu and several of his associates to maritime Southeast Asia. Among the prominent ones were Zhuandao, Cihang, and Yuan Ying. Zhuandao was born in the Zhejiang County of Fujian Province and received his monastic trainings at various monasteries, including the Tiantong Monastery, where he was classmate with Hui Quan, Taixu, and Yuan Ying. And we can see here that's like kind of an old boys network. In 1909, Zhuandao was invited to be the acting abbot of Putuo Monastery when Abbot Xichan was away for retreat. A few years later, in 1913, Zhuandao went to Singapore for the first time to raise funds for the Sangha College of the Nanputuo Monastery. Shortly thereafter, he founded several monasteries in Singapore, including the Potuo Si or Putuo Si in 1915 and the Gongmingshan Poka Si, the Guangmingshan Pujue Si in 1921. 转道 institution building and Dharma propagation effort earned him the reputation as the pioneer of Buddhism in Singapore. Yuan Ying was another important participant in this transregional Buddhist networks. Born in Gudian County of Fujian Province, Yuan Ying was ordained at the Yongquan Monastery in Fuzhou and received his monastic training at the Tiantong Monastery. In 1923, Zhuan Dao, the founding abbot of Gongmingshan, invited Yuan Ying to give a series of Dharma lectures at his monastery in Singapore. After the Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937, Yuan Ying went to Singapore and Malaya to raise funds for the China's war effort against Japanese invasion, which I will discuss more later. In the following year, he became the third abbot of Penang's Gigloxy. A third figure was Ci Hang, a pioneer in the development of Buddhist education in Malaya and Singapore. Ci Hang was born in the Fujian province and ordained at the Emei Peak. In 1927, he enrolled as a student at the Mingnan Buddhist Institute and became influenced by Taishi's idea of human life Buddhism or Renshen Fujiao. Ci Hang taught for several years at the Guangfu Monastery in Wuxi. In 1949, Taishi invited Ci Hang along for his tours of Asian countries where they visited the Buddhist communities in India, Ceylon, Burma, Siam, Malacca, and Singapore. After the tour, Taishi returned to China, while Ci Hang decided to stay in Southeast Asia, where he founded the Lingfeng Buddhist Institute and also played an important role in the expansion of the Poti School in Penang and the founding of the Maha Buddhist School in Singapore. And eventually, Ci Hang became the first Buddhist mummy in Taiwan. The trans-regional Buddhist connections, on the one hand, facilitated the movement of Buddhist monks from China to Southeast Asia and fostered the dissemination of Buddhist ideas to the overseas Chinese community. On the other hand, these networks were used to transfer financial resources from Southeast Asia to fund religious activities in China. For instance, when Taishi became the abbot of the Nanputuo Monastery, he saw the need to fundraise for the promotion of monastic education, and he relied on the South China Sea networks to seek donations from the overseas Chinese. Taishi made 3 visits to Singapore in 1926, 1928, and 1940. During his first visit, Taishi met with several prominent Chinese businessmen and became acquainted with Tang Kaki and Ao Bun Ho. Tang Kaki was born in Xiamen and immigrated to Singapore in 1890 to help his father's rice trading business. He later started his own business and made a fortune from pineapple canning and rubber plantations. When Taishi was in Singapore, Tang Kaki invited the monk to visit his rubber plantations and factories. Ao Bun Ho, a Hakka Chinese born in Burma, and his brother Ao Bun Pa made a fortune selling a tropical pain relief ointment known as the tiger balm in Malaya and Singapore. Ao Bun Ho became a well-known businessman and philanthropist, and he made numerous donations to hospitals, schools, and Buddhist monasteries in China and Southeast Asia. For example, Ao Bun Ho and his brother made a huge donation to the Galaxy in Penang and had their name inscribed on a plaque that reads Ocean of Heaven on the Buddha's Land, on Nantian, this Hai Tian Fo Di over here. And this is the inscription, and the name is here, and this is me with the daughters. During Taishi's visit to Singapore, Ao Bun Ho invited Taishi to stay at his mansion. Taishi engaged Ao Bun Ho in his discussion on Buddhism and trade during his stay and encouraged Ao to observe the Buddhist teachings in his daily life. The transnational Buddhist networks allowed Taishi to build friendly ties with the overseas Chinese in maritime Southeast Asia and enabled him to seek financial support from wealthy business elites in the diaspora. As wealthy Chinese leaders such as Tang Kaki and Ao Bun Ho were important benefactors of Buddhist monastery in Southeast Asia, Taishi was able to solicit donations from this businessman for his renovation plans for the Nanputuo Monastery. For example, when the hall of the Avalokitesvara was destroyed by fire in 1928, Taishi, together with members of the monastery community, embarked on an ambitious fundraising project to seek donations from the overseas Chinese. Within 5 years, they were able to raise approximately 50,000 yuan to rebuild the hall. The South China Sea networks were crucial in channeling the financial resources from the overseas Chinese to the Nanputuo Monastery in Xiamen. In fact, the movement of money via the transregional network could be understood in parallel to the broader remittance networks connecting the overseas Chinese with Xiamen and the Fujian province in general. The networks were significant in supporting the missionary efforts of Taishi and his associates in the propagation of their ideas to maritime Southeast Asia. Taishi had ambitious plans to spread his ideas of human life Buddhism beyond China and wanted to organize an ecumenical Buddhist movement to extend the reach of his reform movement. In September 1926, Taishi came to Singapore and gave a series of talks at the Victoria Memorial Hall, which attracted a large crowd of overseas Chinese. As most of the Buddhist monasteries in Singapore during the early 20th century were disconnected from the lay Buddhists, Taishi believed that the establishment of a lay association would be beneficial in propagating the religion to the overseas Chinese. Therefore, in one of his lectures, Taishi proposed the establishment of a Buddhist association to bring the Dharma to the lay community. Taishi's suggestions inspired Ling Dayuan, a prominent Chinese householder, to establish the China Buddhist Association with the assistance of Zhuangdao and financial support from the local business community. The Chinese Buddhist Association, situated in Singapore's Chinatown, became the first lay Buddhist organization in the British colonial port city. Strategically located in Greater Ai, where most of the Chinese immigrants live, the Chinese Buddhist Association played an important role in propagating the Dharma and offering welfare services to the migrants. In addition, Taishi was making plans to establish a World Buddhist Federation to achieve his ecumenical vision and further expand the South China Sea Buddhist networks into a global network for the propagation of human life Buddhism. He suggested the establishment of a Nanyang Buddhist Association, a regional Buddhist organization to connect the three Southeast Asian countries, that is Indies, Malaya, and Singapore, which is with its headquarters to be based in Singapore. Taishi wanted Singapore to serve as a regional hub for missionary activities and hoped that the Nanyang Buddhist Association could link the three maritime Southeast Asian states to international Buddhist networks. Although Taishi's vision was never materialized, it reveals his ambition to expand the South China Sea networks. When the Sino-Japanese War started in 1937, Buddhist leaders such as Taishi and Yuan Ying condemned the Japanese invasion of China and rallied young monks to support and participate in the Chinese war effort. Subsequently, Sangha rescue teams and logistic support units were formed to treat wounded soldiers in the war against Japanese aggression. The South China Sea networks became an important resource for the Buddhist-led fundraising effort and later served as an escape route for Chinese monks to free South China following the defeat and Chinese occupation of Fujian. A nationalistic monk, Yuan Ying was elected as the leader of the Chinese Buddhist Association Disaster Area Rescue Team and led the Buddhist community in the war against Japanese invasion. In November 1937, Yuan Ying and his disciples Ming Yang went to Southeast Asia to seek donations from the overseas Chinese, where he was asked to become the abbot of Penang's Loxi. With the donations collected, Yuan Ying returned to China to set up 3 rescue units known as the Jiuhu Dui and a hospital to provide medical care for wounded soldiers and war refugees from northern China. Following the fall of Shanghai at the end of 1937, the Japanese arrested Yuan Ying and Ming Yang at the Shanghai Yuanming Lecture Hall for their war-resistant activities. Unlike Yuan Ying, who relied on the networks to raise funds for the Chinese war effort, other monks depended on the transregional connections to escape the war in China and sought refuge in Southeast Asia. Among them were Hui Quan and his disciple Hong Jun, and Gong Hiap and Xiong Kai. These monks fled to Malaya and Singapore, where they later became prominent Buddhist leaders among the overseas Chinese communities. In 1937, Gong Hiap came to Singapore and became the resident teacher of the Singapore Buddhist Lodge. Later, he assumed the abbacy of the Longshan Si Monastery. A year later, Hui Quan arrived and taught at the Longshan Si Monastery in Singapore before becoming the abbot of Miao Xiangling Monastery in Penang. He lived in Malaya until his death in 1943. After Hui Quan's death, his disciple Hong Chuan became the abbot of Penang's Miao Xiangling Monastery, and in 1943 succeeded Zhuan Dao as the abbot of Singapore's Gomeng-san Pogasi. The Japanese invasion and the occupation of coastal China disrupted the South China Sea networks connecting Xiamen and the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia. Following the Japanese occupation of South China, some monks retreated with the Kuomintang government to Chongqing, while others migrated south to Southeast Asia. The Xiamen Buddhist Gazetteer reveals that only 78 monastics were left in Xiamen during the Japanese occupation that lasted until 1945. Although the networks were briefly revived after the war, the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War and the subsequent founding of the People's Republic in 1949 created an unconducive environment for Buddhist activities in mainland China. Consequently, many Buddhist monks left China for the safety of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia in the second half of the 20th century. The focus of my talk is to show how Chinese immigration and transregional mobility contributed to the rise of a vibrant Buddhist community in maritime Southeast Asia. I've coined the term South China Sea Buddhism to highlight the connected history of Buddhist community in China and maritime Southeast Asia. During the 19th century, Chinese monks served as ritual specialists and performed rituals in temples or at funerals for the overseas Chinese community. The pre-institutional form of Chinese Buddhism in the Malay archipelago was characterized by the essential role of businessmen in temple building and management, the mix of Buddhism with Chinese religious practices, and the lack of monks with scriptural knowledge and missionary intent. The last decade of the 19th century saw a number of changes, the most obvious being the arrival of missionary monks and the construction of monasteries. By the turn of the 20th century, the development of institutional Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia was linked to and enabled by broader events in China. The fall of the Qing dynasty, the establishment of the Republic, as well as the new cultural movement had given rise to a number of reformist monks who attempt to establish seminaries and set up lay Buddhist associations and printing presses. Some of them, such as Hui Quan and Tai Shi, became successive abbots of the Nanputuo Monastery, making Xiamen an incubator for Buddhist modernism in southern China. Furthermore, because of its strategic coastal location, Xiamen was both a major port for South China Sea trade as well as an epicenter for Chinese immigration to Southeast Asia. The South China Sea Buddhist networks, on the one hand, facilitated missionary activities of modernist monks in maritime Southeast Asia, and on the other hand, helped channel the financial resources from the overseas Chinese to sponsor temple building projects and religious activities. When the Sino-Japanese War broke out, the transregional Buddhist network played a crucial role in supporting the fundraising campaign, and later, following the Japanese occupation, enabled Buddhist monks to flee China for Southeast Asia. Closer study of the connected history of Buddhist communities could lead us to bridge the study of Southeast Asian Buddhism and the study of Chinese Buddhism. Thank you.